Hey everyone out there, Dan here, aka the Comic Concierge, and welcome to another installment of my Graphic Thoughts videos where I pick out 3 graphic novels, trade paperbacks, or manga, and give you my thoughts and opinions on them. As always, I won't be getting into any major spoilers, but if you're at all worried, let you know that there'll be timestamps down below for you to check out, so you won't have to be worried about getting spoiled at all regarding the books I talk about today. And when I do these videos, I do see if there's any connecting themes or anything like that with the books, and today's a bit of a cheat because I actually have 2 books from the same creator. I just kind of ended up working out that way. But let's get into the books I'll be talking about today. The first book we have is The Age of Selfishness. Next up is How to Fake a Moon Landing. And lastly, we have Kidz from Ablaze Comics. So as you can see, there are 3 different books, 2 very similar, and one that is kind of off the beaten path. But I thought it'd be fun because the first 2 books I'm going to talk about are, I won't say serious, but dealing with non-fiction items, and I thought I'd finish up with this a little bit more of a palate cleanser in a way to keep the variety going. So let's look at the first book, which is The Age of Selfishness, or the full title, Ayn Rand, Morality in the Financial Crisis. And this is written and drawn by Darryl Cunningham. And again, he does the writing, he does the art, he does everything, including obviously most of the research. And as the title would indicate, and as the cover would indicate, this is all about Ayn Rand. The first third, maybe even a little bit more, is all about that, all about her life, where she came from, where her books came from, what her influences were. And then as the book continues, after she passes, it then gets into, well, who did she impact? You know, what types of political structures are still influenced by her work, and what are some things we can tie to? Obviously, with the title, talking about the financial crisis, it does link, the belief system that Ayn Rand helped construct with her works like Atlas Shrugged, and how that led to potentially this idea of absolute individualism, and that belief structure, it kind of basically not thinking about the greater good or the whole, and why that leading that in the sense of how people deal with our finances could lead to kind of unnecessary negative repercussions. So this is very pointed in its belief system or its opinion towards Ayn Rand, and there's a lot of people that do clearly like her work. And it does get into how influential she was, like the part about her life. There are certain, I would say, asides, certain editorializing a bit with some of the choices she makes, basically putting out some of the hypocrisy she grew up with, in the sense of how when she was born in Russia, she came over to the United States, and she often talks about how it's all about what you can do, bringing yourself up with your own bootstraps, but then pointing out that in a large part when she came over here, other family members really help her get established throughout the way, and things like that. Being very pointed to saying, like, despite the fact that Ayn Rand believes this, her actions were this. That wasn't the majority of it, though. It did go into that a little bit. Also gets into her relationship with her husband, and how gets really kind of almost soap opera-esque as things go on, with adultery, and almost like approved adultery, with basically the having multiple partners and things that she dealt with. And she clearly had a life that was perhaps a little bit different, but what you always saw is that a lot of people really glommed on to her thought process and her books, even if they weren't necessarily politically acclaimed. A lot of her books were lambasted by critics when they first came out. But some people saw something in what she was saying, including like Alan Greenspan is a big part of this book, even during her life, because they were kind of friends. They created this own social group where they, that was based into the philosophy that Ayn Rand was preaching. You could say cult-like in a way, like in the sense of like it was a small group with really similar belief system that utilized their group setting to kind of form their own beliefs, and some of the things they would do as well, like I mentioned, where Ayn Rand begins a relationship with one of the members' husbands, even though he's married, and it's very messy. It's dealing a lot with that, but that is just, I think, setting the stage, getting you understanding of who Ayn Rand was. So if you don't know who she is, you have an idea of that. So after that, then I think that's where the bulk of the story gets into. So you kind of understand her philosophy, where it came from, and the people that she influenced. And again, like someone like Alan Greenspan is someone who's hugely important as of right now, dealing with the Federal Reserve, and making that direct link to his time with Ayn Rand and how it's impacted the way he operates on a daily basis. Because we forget that Alan Greenspan has a lot of power as an individual. If you look over the last, few decades of what he was able to do, positive or negative, depending upon your point of view. We often point to people like the the president, senators, and things like that. But those roles, especially ones that aren't necessarily always elected directly by constituents, sometimes are not necessarily as focused on as much. And I think this kind of gets into that. Again, gets into a big piece of the financial structure here. Looking at the art side, with this being a comic, the art is purposely simple and similar with this book and the next book, where it's not necessarily about trying to impress you with a expressive art style here. There's enough there. Really, like, if you look at this cover, this image is pretty consistent with the art throughout the book. A lot of general grids. The page layouts are pretty straightforward because it's all about conveying information, getting you comfortable moving one step to the next. And considering this is probably a book that's going to potentially appeal to an audience that is outside your normal comic book audience, I think Darryl Cunningham is probably aware of that. So he's not going to try to do anything that is beyond the norm with your general page design. He wants to make it very clear, very easy to read. So there's, it's a very welcoming to new readers. So again, this is probably a great book if you want to get someone who's, I can never read comics. I don't like anything about comics. If they are into politics or finances or something like that, they probably would like this. And, if you're a huge Ayn Rand fan, would you like this? Probably not, because it is very critical of her belief system. It's not hiding the fact that it finds problematic elements of what she believed and the downfall of that mindset of kind of the individual over all else. Thinking taxes are illegal and that government should be doing is basically the military, and everything else should be left to the individual themselves. A big part of that potentially with Ayn Rand is because growing up in Russia, she saw just the destruction a government could cause, like what it could do when it would overstep its reach. And then one would assume she, in her life, said that wasn't where her belief system came from. I think this makes the argument that it would be impossible for not to influence her in any way. But I was, rather captivated by this. And I've never read any Ayn Rand books. I just never had the thought process. I've read a lot about her. I've watched a lot about her. I've heard a lot of people spout why they love her work and why it's influenced them in many ways. I know many people, friends of mine, that are huge fans of her work. I can't say I'm a fan of her work or not a fan of her work, because like I mentioned, I've never read it myself. But I feel this did give me a better understanding of who she was and why she operated and why she is such an important figure. Like her work or not, you can't deny her influence has only grown. As I mentioned, her books were not critically acclaimed. They tried to make movies off them. Those weren't very successful. They've tried to make movies again, actually, I think the last decade or so, and those were awful. There's a lot of legality regarding the rights of her books, too. It's kind of all over the place. It's kind of funny when I guess not funny, the right word, ironic in a way, when you look at the struggles that there have been trying to make products or make movies based upon her work, and how you've had people just try to do it because if they don't make the movie, they're going to lose the rights, and you get really awful movies. Even people, I think, who believe in her system and like the books should probably watch those movies and, either not know they exist or be rather embarrassed by them. But ultimately, the important part is this book itself. I did feel like I also had a better understanding of things like the financial crisis within this, like a good documentary. Is it being 100%, is the viewpoint here pointed? Is it trying to get both sides? I think it does a good job at least providing context of understanding why these individuals did it. And again, it is very critical of it. And personally, I don't necessarily have an issue with that. I don't think art by any means needs to necessarily be both sides argument or something like that. Sometimes there are not both sides, or art's not designed to always kind of feel that you're comfortable in your worldview. It should in some ways help challenge that. To be honest, does this challenge my worldview? Not really. It's probably much more geared towards my line of thinking, but at the same time, it was getting into information I wasn't aware of. So I guess it's easier for me to say that when you're reading something that is something you agree with against something that you don't. But if you are a huge Ayn Rand fan and would recommend anything that would be on the other side, I would be open to read it. Like I said, I like to read pretty much anything. It doesn't necessarily have to be a comic book. I would be up to anything. Let me know in the comment section below. But yeah, I think this is certainly going to appeal to a certain audience per se. If this is, you care less about finances, you care less about that piece, you're probably not going to enjoy the later half. But I think the part about Ayn Rand would be in her life is universally appealing, just because despite the fact some people may not agree with her take on life, what she did leave was interesting, was fascinating to read by. So maybe just read that piece, and then ease in and see if you continue to like it. And maybe by the end, you'll find out this fact that maybe you're into this much more than you realize. All right, let's get to the next book I'm going to be talking about, and that's How to Fake a Moon Landing. And now this is not a guide to how Stanley Kubrick directed the moon landing, but it gets into the conspiracy theories that exist a little bit, but it really gets into the anti-science movement that has been existing for some time now. And I know we live, being this on YouTube, YouTube is full of a lot of different conspiracy videos about pretty much everything. Like, I'm sure there's a conspiracy video about how I'm not actually a human being or something like that. There's everything from dinosaurs aren't real to flat earth, whatever you have. For those that like reading Department of Truth and the way it takes on conspiracies, this is not necessarily like this. This is, again, a piece of nonfiction. The art style is very similar to the last book. It does what's necessary. There's a good humor to it. It's funny, it's informative, it's never dry. So there's a lot of information here, but what it does, it breaks down a lot of the misconceptions that exist right now. Again, like starting with the moon landing, and where did that idea of the moon landing being fake come from? Where did that conspiracy been unearthed? Like, what was the starting point of it? And it goes through kind of that and where it comes from, but also the problematic nature of that conspiracy theory and why it doesn't hold water, really, once you really get beyond just the general talking points, kind of going through a lot of the talking points people tend to bring up, like the lack of stars, why is the flag moving, all these pieces, and then trying to debunk them. Is this going to change someone's mind that is steadfast that the moon landing was fake? Probably not, because I think, again, it gets into this book itself, like how those belief systems get so entrenched in individuals that it's beyond the idea of science or knowledge. It's again, a belief system, despite the fact that science is not based upon that. It's based upon fact. It's based upon what's in reality. It's like science is real if you believe it or not. And I think it touches upon that. The moon landing is just one piece of it. And then it transitions to other things like evolution, climate change, fracking, pretty much all the key points that you get into. It does not talk about dinosaurs being fake or anything like that. Maybe that'll be in the second volume. But similar to the Ayn Rand book, and I didn't necessarily talk about with the Ayn Rand book the humor that's there, and I think they both do have a good sense of humor, because when you do have a book like this, it can get rather dry, like an informational dump. But I thought, especially with the art, it does have that cartoony style. You have bits and pieces where, it utilizes the medium to do some good visual gags to kind of keep your interest going, so you're never bored with it. And if you are interested in this information, like, I do think if there's one negative to this, there are a number of videos or other resources that touch upon similar information. Is this bringing anything necessarily new to the party, or breaking down these misconceptions in a different way that hasn't been done before? Not necessarily. It is very comprehensive, though. I will give it that. It's a nice, tight little package. And this did come out, a number of years ago. This did come out 7 years ago. So it was on the forefront of looking at the problematic nature of the anti-science movement and the impact it can have. Again, with the last book, this is very pointed in its criticism. This is not designed to kind of make everyone feel comfortable. There's no question beyond the first few pages of where this leans. Some people might have some issues with that, because it's not trying to pander to what they believe and saying that their belief system is just as legitimate. No, it's pretty much saying, you think the moon landing is fake, that's not based in reality, and this is why. So, which I think is important, because sometimes there are not two sides to an argument. There's one side, it's like gravity exists. You might not believe gravity exists, but the fact that you're not floating off the planet is proof that it exists. So we don't need to have that conversation of why your point of view is legitimate. So I know a lot of people, there's that saying that, all opinions are valid. I don't necessarily agree with that. I think opinions need to have evidence to back them up, even if it's criticism of art or something based in science. If you're going to spout an opinion, you need some sort of objective truth to strengthen it in a way. Sometimes, I'm guilty of not doing that when I give reviews, again, but I do think if you're going to spout an opinion, having opinions not enough. You need to be able to back it up with some sort of bit of information that might be subjective. I mean, art is, again, subjective. Like, I like the art style of this book. Some people may not, because it's too simple. There's no, objective truth there. That is something that is very subjective. But this, again, is trying to define what are those objective truths, and why are they being ignored by a large amount of people, and what is who's benefiting from that is ultimately the question. Who's benefiting from this mindset? And it's very pointed at who that is and why that's problematic for the rest of us. So, all right, next up is a completely different book. Let's have a nice little palate cleanser, a nice fun book. Although I say fun, and this is pretty dreary at times. There has some dark moments in its kids. And this is from Ablaze Comics. This is written by Arlene Docodry. I apologize if I pronounced that incorrectly. Artwork by Jocelyn Jorrit. Letters by Carlos N. Mangle. And also Sandra Temafronte. And this again comes from Ablaze Comics. My apologies for any mispronunciations there. I will put in the comment section below the actual wording, so if you actually want to know what those names are and if I send them incorrectly, you can check that out there. But looking at kids, what is this book about? And this book exists in, I guess you could call it a dystopian future, a zombie future, and focuses on kids that are existing there. They don't necessarily have any parents. They've kind of all come together and are trying to survive. And this does feel much like in the vein of those classic 80s kids movies, The Goonies, Spielberg, E.T., but maybe with a little bit more modern sensibility, and it's a bit darker. Like this wouldn't, if you read this, if you gave it to a kid, I don't know if it would necessarily be fully appropriate because there's language, there's blood here, there's death. It would probably be rated like maybe a hard PG-13 because that's really dependent upon it. But it may not be appropriate for probably anyone under the age of 13. I'd guess, depending upon the kid. Kids are different. Maybe check it out yourself and see if they would like it. But I do think it is more so written towards the adult to impact the kids in us all, especially with those that have grown up with those type of movies. And I think one of the things it's most successful at is the way it does write the kids' dialogues, because I've written a lot of books that you have a lot of kids communicating and it just feels false. It feels like this is lingo that was outdated 20 years ago. These do not feel like actual kids. Either they're way above their age, they're way too wise, or it just feels very generic. I thought the fact that these are all kids all together, I think that did work out well. And I did really love the art style here. I actually was really surprised because in the back of this edition, there are draft pages that show like the pencils for this. And I did not expect that, to be honest, because it does have a very digital look to it. But it was originally in pencils, and then I don't know if it stayed in pencils and transitioned to something else, but it did start with pencils, and the coloring does feel very digital. It does have that digital look, which would be, I think it works for this. Definitely feel like the moving animated cells, which in turn I think makes sense because a big part of this is, again, that love affair with those types of movies when you actually have a character called Spielberg and he's about making movies, and that's where that name comes from. It might be a bit forced, but I think it certainly is a reference that fits. And I did like the coloring in the sense of there are bits and pieces in which you see the actual footage of the movies that they were making and how it was able to kind of get that VHS look on the page. I thought was pretty impressive. And two, I think that what was maybe one of the best strengths of the cartooning was how the character designs help inform personality of characters. It did that really well. So just by looking at the individual, looking at the kid, you had an idea of who they were, what they were like, and then it kind of added to the depth. If I had one problem though, much of this is just them trying to survive. Things get a little messy with when a young girl and her sister in a wheelchair show up because they're trying to get to Pittsburgh with their family. And it causes some conflict because you have kind of the main boy who is the leader, quote unquote, or at least he's the one that tries to drive what everyone's doing. And he takes issue with her. And I just felt like his character felt a little bit all over the place in a way. And he makes a lot of decisions that I felt weren't as earned. There's a turn that he makes, and I didn't feel like it felt natural with what the story was doing in a way. The way they approached it, I thought they would really round it out a little bit more and really give more reasoning to the things he was doing. But I felt like that was something they left a little bit too much on the cutting room floor. They could have developed that further. When he is basically doing things that's going to risk the lives of other individuals in a very severe way. I don't know. That was the only other takeaway. Outside of that, I did like the dynamic with the kids. It does feel very heavily influenced from things like Zombieland. Like you have these kids that are spouting rules, and again, very much in that type of vein. So it does feel heavily influenced from other properties, but that immaculation of all those different things does, I think, give out something a bit original. It's a very fast-paced comic. I went through this rather quickly. This is the first volume, 5 issues or so. So it was not a lot of dialogue, but one of the other strengths of the cartooning too was, if you're going to call out Spielberg, you need to be a strong visual storyteller, not just in your cartooning and in character design, but how you set the stage, like how you're telling the story through camera angles, things like that. And it does that similar to how Spielberg, when he would have a movie based on kids, that the camera angles would always be through their perspective. A great deal. Like you're always seeing things through their eyes, so you're on the same level as them, this did a lot of that as well. And it does get, like I said, rather dark. Like I did really get to enjoy all these different characters, and it was willing to go places that maybe I didn't necessarily expect it to, which is why I would be concerned maybe to give this to actual kids, because it, not necessarily that there aren't kids movies that deal with death, but the death here can be a bit brutal in a way. To me, it definitely is taking the way that adults would become deranged in the sense of a zombie movie, like how someone who's normal may become rather evil or do things that are morally repulsive, and saying that kids should probably be no different in that, which I thought was a bit refreshing. Like it didn't necessarily show that these kids, that innocence that they have has been removed, but at times you do see it, which makes it all the more tragic. So I didn't know what to expect with this book. I read it when it was in issues and ended up really liking it a lot, and I wanted to return to it, read it all in one sitting, and it does read much better as a graphic novel compared to what it was in issues. So, don't dismiss it because you hate zombies or because you're sick of dystopian future, or maybe you're not really into Ablaze Comics. It's not, a huge publisher, but of everything I've read by them, this is by far the favorite book that they did. So I don't necessarily have a favorite book. I usually try to finish this up with the book I enjoyed the most. These are very different books. I mean, this was much more enjoyable, much more entertaining, but I thought in the sense of a fulfilling read, the other books were probably Ayn Rand book was the one that I thought really had me thinking the most out of everything I read this week. So anyways, that's it for me for this week. Just remember that comics are for everyone. The key is finding the right one. Until next time, keep reading.